The mistake wasn't being too giving, too loyal, too committed. Those things have value, those things matter, those things are not the problem. The mistake was giving all of it unconditionally, without limits, without variance, without a single moment that introduced the possibility that it could stop. Unconditional availability is indistinguishable from furniture, present, useful, relied upon, never thought about until it's gone. And by the time it's gone, the replacement has already been sourced, because nothing that reliable ever seemed like it needed to be protected. The most replaceable people in any room are not the least valuable, they are the most predictable, and predictability, at a certain point, becomes the same thing as invisible. If you want to understand exactly why this happens, hit that like button. Welcome to Unfiltered Adulthood, where we explore the quiet shifts that reshape us. Subscribe, and let's get back to the story. It started as a strength, and for a long time, it was one. Always available, always reliable, always the person the room could count on without having to ask twice. This was not accidental, it was built deliberately, over years, from a genuine belief that consistency was the highest form of value a person could offer, that showing up without condition was the thing that made you worth keeping. And the belief was not wrong. Consistency is valuable, reliability is rare. The person who shows up without drama and delivers without complaint is genuinely harder to find than most rooms acknowledge. The problem was not the value of the thing, it was the way the thing was offered, without limit, without condition, without a single moment of variance that might have communicated to the room that it was a choice rather than a default. A choice can be withdrawn. A default cannot, and the room, unconsciously, accurately, filed the difference. 31 months at the same job, every deadline met, every request accommodated, every additional task absorbed without negotiation, every inconvenient ask met with the same frictionless yes that had become the only response anyone in that building had ever received from them. And somewhere in those 31 months, the yes had stopped being a decision and become an expectation, had stopped being noticed and become assumed, had stopped being something the room was grateful for and become something the room simply relied upon without gratitude, because gratitude requires awareness and awareness requires the occasional possibility that the thing might not be there. The possibility had never been introduced. Not once, not even slightly, not even in the mildest form of a delayed response or a qualified yes, and so the room had never had occasion to register what it had never been given the data point that would have produced the awareness of potential loss, had simply incorporated the availability into its operating assumptions the way you incorporate a light switch, present, functional, taken for granted, unremarkable until the moment it stops working. 6 people in that office who were less reliable, less consistent, less available, 3 of them more visible, more discussed, more specifically valued, not because their work was better, but because their work was less predictable, their presence was less guaranteed, their yes came with enough occasional friction that the room had been required, repeatedly, to register that it was a yes rather than an inevitability. The friction was the signal, and they had never produced any. The restructure was where it became visible, but the restructure wasn't the cause, it was just the moment the accumulated invisibility became impossible to ignore. Their name came up in the planning conversation, briefly, practically, without the specific weight that accompanies someone the room has been required to value consciously. Just a practical consideration, a resource allocation question, a slot that needed to be filled by someone and could, without particular difficulty, be filled by someone else. Not because they were insufficient, not because their work had been poor, not because anyone in that room had made a decision to exclude them, but because no one in that room had been given sufficient cause, across 31 months of frictionless availability, to build the specific internal case for their irreplaceability, the case that gets made automatically for people whose presence has occasionally felt uncertain, whose yes has occasionally required a beat before arriving, whose absence from a project has occasionally produced a gap specific enough to be felt. They heard about it secondhand, the way decisions get communicated when the person they affect wasn't the subject of a difficult conversation, a colleague, a corridor, a casual mention that landed with a weight entirely disproportionate to the casual way it was delivered. The question that arrived that evening wasn't anger, wasn't injustice, wasn't the clean emotion of having been wronged. It was something harder and more specific, the recognition that this outcome was not a surprise, that some part of them had always known this was the architecture of what they had built, had always understood that unconditional availability produces a specific kind of invisibility, and had continued building it anyway, because the alternative, introducing conditions, introducing limits, introducing the possibility of a no, had always felt more dangerous than the invisibility it would have prevented. The invisibility had felt like safety, that was the thing, the core of it, the part that made it most difficult to simply correct and move on. It had felt like safety because it was, in its way, safe, protected from the specific rejection that comes when you ask for something and the answer is no, protected from the vulnerability of being a yes that someone consciously chose rather than a yes that someone simply received because it was always there. They had been protecting themselves from a rejection that had never come. And in doing so, had produced the quieter, slower, more complete rejection of becoming someone no room ever had to fight to keep. The change didn't look like withholding, that's the first thing to understand, because the instinct, on hearing this diagnosis, is to overcorrect, to introduce artificial scarcity, to manufacture unavailability as a strategy, and strategy is visible, and visible strategy produces a different kind of invisibility. The invisibility of someone who is transparently performing a version of themselves they don't actually inhabit. What changed was quieter and more internal. A recalibration of what the yes was connected to, a restoration of the link between the offer and the actual decision, a reintroduction of the beat before the answer that communicated, without performance, without strategy, without manipulation, that the yes was a choice and not a default. One request, declined, not dramatically, not with extensive explanation, just declined, a prior commitment, a genuine one, communicated without apology. And the room, briefly, registered something it hadn't registered in 31 months, the awareness that the availability had a limit, that the limit had just been encountered, that the resource was not, after all, unconditional. That registration was not dramatic either. Just a slight adjustment in how the next request was framed, slightly more consideration in the ask, slightly less assumption in the delivery, the room recalibrating, unconsciously, to a new piece of information about what they were actually dealing with. 3 months of that recalibration, 3 months of yes that arrived after a beat rather than before one, 3 months of occasional no that communicated boundaries without announcing them. And the room had updated its model, had begun to register the presence as something that required some awareness rather than something that could simply be assumed. Not irreplaceable, that's too large a claim, and irreplaceability is never fully achievable and rarely the actual goal, just no longer invisible, no longer filed under furniture, no longer the kind of presence that a room forgets to value because it has never been given a reason to remember that valuing it requires some effort. This is not a story about becoming difficult. The reliability remained, the consistency remained, the quality of the work remained, the genuine willingness to show up and deliver remained. None of that changed, none of that needed to change, the value of those things was real and remained real. What changed was the packaging, the way the value was communicated, the presence or absence of a signal that the value was a choice. Some relationships shifted. A few people in that office who had operated on the assumption of unconditional access found the recalibration uncomfortable, found the occasional no disorienting, found the beat before the yes slightly harder to work with than the instant yes had been, and their discomfort was informative, was data, was the clearest possible signal about what those particular relationships had been built on. The ones that remained after the recalibration were different in quality. Not more numerous, not warmer, not more dramatic, just more honest, more accurately reflective of actual mutual regard rather than the one-directional assumption that unconditional availability had been producing for years. The next position came with different dynamics, deliberately chosen, partly for that reason. A room that required the occasional no to function well, that valued specific expertise over general availability, that had been built around people whose presence came with enough variance to be consciously registered. The yes, in that room, landed differently, not because it was less frequent, but because it was understood to be a choice, and choices, unlike defaults, require the room to register what it's receiving. The mistake that makes you too easy to replace isn't caring too much. It's making your presence so unconditional that no one ever has to consider what it would mean to lose it.